In today's video, we're going to talk about arrays. We're going to talk about what an array is, how you create an array, how to access different values in an array, some considerations for different efficiencies of operations of an array, if that doesn't make sense. We'll discuss this more later. And then we'll actually kind of end with how arrays are actually objects and then discussing different array methods. So first things first, what is an array? So an array is a collection of indexable, ordered, comma-separated values of any data type. In other words, an array is a list of values. But when creating that list, those values are going to contain an index starting from 0. So in programming, in most languages, the first value of an array is going to be at index 0. So arrays in JavaScript as well are 0-based, meaning the first value starts at 0. So as you add values to these arrays, they're going to be given an index. And this allows you to use that index to get those values. And the index is just a numerical value starting at 0. And then the second value would be at index 1, and then index 2, and so on and so forth as you add more elements to that array. Okay? And they are ordered. So they maintain their order. Their order isn't randomized. You're guaranteed to have that same order of values as you added them to the array. Okay, so if something is at index 0, assuming you don't mutate the array in some way, it's going to stay there. Also, when you create an array, you're going to separate your values just by commas as you create it. And I'll show you this in a second. And they can be of any data type. So they can be of type string, of type number. You can have an array of objects. It doesn't matter. It can be of any data type within the array. All right. So arrays are especially helpful when you have a collection of kind of related items. So if you have a list of items, say you have a list of groceries. Well, this is a list of related items that you would potentially put in an array separated by commas. So how do we actually create an array within JavaScript? Well, there's a few different ways that you can do it. The most common here is on line 17. It's creating an array by using square brackets. All right. So what we do here is we have a left square bracket and then a right square bracket. And then between those brackets, that's where we put our values within our array separated by commas. So here you can see I have 1, 2, 3. We have created an array within these square brackets here. And then the values of this array are 1, 2, and 3. And then if I run this program and I log out my array here, you're going to see that I get a representation of my array 1, 2, and 3 separated by commas. Now, there are a couple of other ways to create an array. You can also use the new array constructor. So, like I said, alluded to earlier, arrays are objects. And you can use this built-in array object to create new arrays within JavaScript. Now, this is kind of rarely done, but sometimes can be useful if you need to just create an array of a certain length and need that within your program. So here you can call the array constructor by calling new, using the new keyword, and then calling the array, which this array object is something that JavaScript just gives you within a JavaScript runtime. It is a global object that you can use. And then you can, here within the parentheses, this specifies how many items you want in your array. So right here, this is saying, okay, give me a new array of 3 items and fill that array with 0. So I call .fill on this call here, and that will fill my array with whatever value I put in here. So let me log this out first. So here you can see I have an array of 3 items, and then I filled those items with 0. But I can also put a value of true in there. And then you can see I have a new array with 3 items and each value is true, the Boolean. And this could be any item that I fill this array with. Now, if I don't fill the array, it will basically create a new array of nothing. Like there's technically nothing in this array. See how it says, okay, this console logs out that I have an array here of 3 empty items. So this is literally just an empty array. This isn't even an array of 3 undefined or 3 nulls. It is 3 just empty items. This is an empty array of length 3. All right. So that is a second way to create an array, much less common compared to this top way here. Now you can also use that array object again, but use array.from and create a new array from whatever you pass in within the parentheses. And this is very common when you're working with DOM elements. And I'll be going over manipulating the DOM in future videos, but if you get an array of DOM elements by using something like query selector all, meaning you get all elements on the page that are H1 tags, for example. Well, that actually returns what is called a node list. It doesn't return an actual array, to where it doesn't give us as many kind of helpful methods and things like that. And I'll be going over array methods in future videos, but it doesn't give us those kind of helper methods. So it's very common to then call array.from that node list that you get, and that will basically turn that node list into an array. That is very common to do, but I'm sure I will cover that when we get into manipulating the DOM more. But here, I actually pass in a string, and strings are iterable, meaning you can iterate over each value of this string or each character of this string with a for loop. So with this array.from method, anything that you can iterate over or anything you could potentially write a for loop over, you can pass into this array.from method, and it will create a new array. It will basically iterate over this string here and create a new array of every character. This would work for sets. This would work for the keys of a object. If you did object.keys and then use that, I'll cover objects in future videos. But here we can see that I actually get a new array here of each character of this string. And this can be thought of as it iterating over the string and adding each character to a new array and then returning that here in my array. So you can use this array object that JavaScript gives you for free and then call array.from, pass in some iterable, so some value that you could write a for loop over and iterate through each item. That's going to place each item into a new array and create an array from that iterable that you pass in. Okay. So that can be useful. Like it can be useful to potentially create an array from a set sometimes. And a nice way to remove duplicates from an array is actually turning it into a set and then creating a new array from that set. But we'll cover that in my sets video. So those are a few of the most common ways to create an array. This first way here of using square brackets is definitely the most common, but all of these you'll probably see somewhere in your code, and they all have different use cases that can be helpful at different points in time. All right. So we now know what an array is. It's basically a list of ordered values, and each one has an index. Now, how do you actually access values in that array? Well, I talked about this a little bit earlier. You access a value in an array by passing it an index, because automatically JavaScript will give these values of this array an index. And like I said, the first value of the array is at index 0. So here, this string first is at index 0. And then here, this second value of this array is at index 1. And this is at index 2, index 3, and then this final value of this array is at index 4. And then we can access values of this array by, you essentially take the name of the array and then you add square brackets to the end of the array and then pass those square brackets in index. So I know it looks a little bit funny, but this will become second nature to you as you get more practice with it. You'll be indexing arrays a lot within your program, so this will become more clear. But the way that this is done is you add square brackets to the end of the variable name that stores your array, and then you pass that label an index here in square brackets. And this will return whatever value is contained at that index. Okay, so let me console log this first value here. So as you can see, when I console log my label of first, my constant first, and it indexes the 0th value of this array, it returns first, the string first, which is the first value of this array. Now, what if I want to get the last value of an array? Well, I can actually use an array's length to get the last value of an array. So arrays are, like I said, they're actually objects in JavaScript, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. But this array-like object gives you a length property, which the .length property on an array basically tells you how many elements or how many items are in an array. So here, if I use the label of my array and I call .length on my array, it's going to return how many elements are in my array. So here in this example, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements in my array. My array .length is going to be 5. So let me kind of prove that here, and then .length. As you can see here, there are 5 elements in this array. So to get the last value of an array, well, since arrays are 0-based indexed, this means that the last value is going to be the length of the array minus 1, because this is index 0, 1, 2, 3, and index 4, but there's 5 elements in this array. So my last element is actually at the length of the array, 5, minus 1. That's the index it is at. So it is at the 4th index. So to get the last value of an array, you could actually just pass in the length of your array minus 1. And this is a very standard practice that you will see within your programs to get the last value of an array. So if I didn't break anything here, you should see this console log the last element of my array, which you do. Okay. Now, this to get items in the middle of the array, it's basically the same thing here. You just pass in an index to get whatever element you want. So if I want the 3rd element here, I could pass in index 2. And that's going to return the 3rd item in my array. And now, if I want the 4th item, I can pass in the 3rd index. Now, if I pass in an index that doesn't exist, so passing index 10 here, when my array only has 5 elements, that index doesn't exist within this array, so I actually get undefined. It doesn't throw an error, but I do get undefined. There isn't an index within my array. Now, can I use a negative index? Like, can I just use -1 here to get the last element of the array? As you can see, that does not work. That technically tries to access the property on this object of -1, which doesn't exist. So based on how arrays are implemented in JavaScript, you cannot use negative indexes to get a certain value from the end of the array. So example array at -1 does not work to get the last item. You would have to use the array's length, -1 or -2, to kind of do that negative indexing. Okay. And if the index does not exist, or if a value doesn't exist at a certain index that you pass in here, you will get undefined. So that is how you access values in an array within JavaScript. Now, real quickly here, when considering some of these operations that you might perform on an array, sometimes it's important to consider the algorithmic complexity. So in computer science, there's something called algorithmic complexity, and it basically tells you how fast your program is running or how fast a certain algorithm is running. And when writing your own algorithms or your own functions and writing your own programs, sometimes it can be important to think about how fast your program is running. And when doing these different array operations, it can be helpful to think about how fast these operations are going to be running. Now, usually it doesn't matter. But I think that one thing that can be an important consideration is that what are kind of arrays built to do? What are they best at doing? So here are just some general notes on the algorithmic efficiency of arrays, or what arrays are really good at. So if you insert and delete from the end of an array, it is very fast. This is commonly called pushing and popping from an array. You push an element to the end of an array and you pop an element from the back of an array. And arrays actually have these built-in methods, which I'll cover in future videos. So that is very fast. Now, if you insert and delete elements anywhere else except for the end of an array, that's actually a little bit slower. That occurs in linear time, which isn't necessarily terrible, but it is slower than inserting and deleting at the end of an array. And the reason for this is because how arrays are stored in memory. If you insert and delete on an array, you actually have to reorder all of the indexes of that array, which effectively means you have to create your array all over again. So you have to create a new array, technically speaking, in memory to store that new ordered array. To reorder all those indexes, it's going to take a linear time. So that's going to be slower. But if you just add and remove elements from the back of an array, then you don't need to reorder all those indexes. You can just add an additional index to the end of an array, which is why it happens so fast. But to insert and delete anywhere else, you're going to have to kind of reorder the array, and that's going to be linear time. Now, if you're getting an element at a certain index in an array, it's going to be very fast. You already have that index. You know where it is. That's going to take constant time. It's very fast to set an index. So if I say my array at index 0 is equal to a certain value, that's going to happen very fast. What would be slow is if you push a value onto the front of the array. Then you have to shift around your indexes of your array. But if you just set a value at an index, that happens very fast. Creating a new array is going to be kind of linear time. It's going to take a little bit longer than getting and setting values. And then searching an unsorted array is going to be, you might have to go through every value of that array. So that's technically called linear time. It's going to take a little bit longer. If it's a sorted array, there's some kind of special things you can do there, which takes logarithmic time, which is a little bit faster there. But in general, just know that arrays are very fast at getting a certain index, setting an index. They are fast at pushing and popping elements from the back of an array. Okay. Now, the final thing I want to talk about here is how arrays are actually objects. So if we look at here and we do type of square bracket, so I'm creating an empty array here. And maybe to just make this more clear, I'll put some values in it. So a type of this array, we actually get that it is an object. And this goes back to how I said earlier about how in JavaScript, arrays are actually implemented as objects, which is a good thing. We can actually, it gives us certain methods that we can call on our arrays. So as you could see earlier, when I did array.length, we're actually calling the .length method on that array, which gives us the length of the array. That can be very helpful. So arrays in JavaScript are actually objects, and I'll cover objects and these array methods in future videos. But sometimes you still want to know, okay, well, how do I know if it's an array or versus like a generic JavaScript object? What if I want to know that this is actually the array object and not just the object? Well, you can use the array.isArray function. So this returns true. I use array.isArray, I pass it this array, and it returns true because this is an array. But if I pass it an empty object here, you're going to see that I get false. Okay, so if you need to differentiate between an array and an object, I would use array.isArray. Now, since arrays are object, you can actually add values to an array just like you would an object. So here, I create an empty array, and then I say my array.YouTube channel is equal to code Ryan. So I use the object dot syntax to add a property called YouTube channel, and then I give it the value of code Ryan. And as you will see here, this works. When I console log my array.YouTube channel, it will log out code Ryan. So you can add properties to arrays just like you would with objects, because at the end of the day, arrays are objects. Now, you don't necessarily want to do this like ever, because if you want to have like a key value store, use an object. Don't use an array for that. As one thing that you'll see here is when I try to console log my array.length, even when it has this YouTube channel property, you'll see that it is still 0 here. It is still 0 because like JavaScript doesn't expect you to use arrays in this way, and the dot length of an array needs those indexes. It kind of ignores the property values here. So in general, you don't want to add properties to an array like this. This just kind of goes to show that arrays are objects. And then just to kind of prove a point here, if I say my array at the 0th index is first value, and then I cancel out the length of this array, you're going to see that I do get a length of 1 here, because the length method on an array needs those indexes to determine the length of an array. So like I said here, and I can get rid of all that, like I said here, arrays are actually implemented as objects in JavaScript. So why even have arrays? Why wouldn't we just use objects for everything? Well, for one, it can make it, just having a list of items, a list of indexed items, can just be a little bit easier to reason about. And that can be conducive to doing certain operations. Like if you're going to map over an array or go over every item of an array and perform an operation on that, it's much easier to iterate over an array compared to iterating over an object. And arrays also have some special methods to them that are a little bit easier to work with compared to objects. So these properties of an array object will make them easier to use for certain situations. And as you gain more experience, this will become more and more clear. So these built-in methods like .length, .push, .pop, filter, sort, all these different methods on arrays kind of make them a little bit special and more useful in some instances compared to just objects. So this is why we have arrays, even though we also have objects and arrays are implemented as objects. But in summary here, an array is a collection of indexable, ordered, comma-separated values of any data type. So they're essentially a list of values, and they're useful for when you have a collection of related values. The indexes are automatically created for you, and the first value is going to have index 0. You create an array by using the square bracket notation or by calling the new array constructor, although using square bracket notation is much more common. Or you can also call array.from and pass it some iterable, something that you could write a for loop over. You access values in an array by passing the index of the value that you want to receive. The operations that are going to be kind of most efficient to do on an array are going to be pushing and popping at the end of an array and getting and setting an index of an array. And then, like I said, arrays are actually objects in JavaScript, but arrays are still useful because they have a lot of helpful methods on them, which I will cover in this video that is linked right here. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in that next one.